My neighbor intercepted me at the elevator on a quiet Tuesday morning, and at first, I thought it would be another polite exchange, the kind where people smile, nod, and go on with their day. I was wrong. Very wrong. That single moment, standing between the hum of the elevator cables and the faint smell of cleaning detergent in the hallway, would quietly begin unraveling a truth I had avoided for years. I had lived in that building for nearly a decade. Long enough to recognize footsteps, long enough to memorize which doors slammed and which elevators groaned before opening. Long enough to believe that routine meant safety. My neighbor, Mark, lived 2 floors above me. We weren't friends, not really, but we shared that unspoken familiarity people develop when they see each other often without ever truly knowing one another. That morning, I was running late. Coffee in one hand, phone in the other, mentally rehearsing excuses for my boss. The elevator doors slid open just as I reached them, and I let out a breath of relief. That's when Mark stepped forward, holding the door open with his arm. He smiled, but there was something off about it, too deliberate, too knowing. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. I hesitated. Everything in me wanted to say no. But years of politeness, of not wanting to appear rude or dramatic, made me step inside. The doors closed behind us, sealing the space into a small metal box where the air suddenly felt heavier. "You look tired," he said casually, pressing the button for the lobby. I shrugged. "Long week already." He nodded slowly, like someone confirming a thought. I figured. "Things haven't been easy for you lately." That was the first moment my stomach tightened. Because I hadn't told him anything. Not about my sleepless nights. Not about the arguments echoing through my apartment walls. Not about the growing sense that my life was slipping slightly out of alignment while I pretended everything was fine. "What do you mean?" I asked, forcing a light tone. He didn't answer right away. The elevator hummed downward, passing floors too slowly. Then he said something that made my pulse spike. "I hear things," he said. "Walls are thin. People talk more than they realize." I laughed, but it came out strained. "This building hears everything." "Exactly," he replied, meeting my eyes in the reflective steel wall. "And sometimes, it tells stories." That's when I knew this wasn't small talk. For years, I had built my life on appearances. On being the quiet, reliable one. The person who didn't cause trouble. Who smiled through discomfort and swallowed questions that felt inconvenient. My marriage looked stable from the outside. My job looked secure. My life looked fine. But behind closed doors, the cracks had been spreading slowly, silently. Mark leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You deserve better, you know." The words hit harder than they should have. Not because they were kind, but because they echoed thoughts I'd never said out loud. "I don't know what you think you've heard," I said, trying to regain control, "but I'm fine." He raised his hands slightly, as if surrendering. "I'm not accusing. Just observing." The elevator dinged. Lobby. I moved to step out, but he spoke again. "Be careful," he said. "Not everyone who smiles at you wants the same things you do." I walked out without replying, my heart racing. The glass doors slid shut behind me, and through them, I saw his reflection still watching me as the elevator ascended again. All day, his words replayed in my mind. At my desk. In meetings. On my commute home. I told myself I was overreacting. That he was just a nosy neighbor projecting his own problems. But deep down, I knew why it unsettled me so much. Because part of me felt seen. That night, I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the dark window that reflected my own tired face back at me. For the first time in a long while, I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. What if pretending everything is fine is actually the most dangerous thing of all? And that was only the beginning. That night, sleep refused to come easily. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in the elevator over and over again. Mark's voice, calm yet unsettling, echoed in my head. "You deserve better." It wasn't what he said, it was how confidently he said it, as if he already knew parts of my life I had worked hard to keep hidden. I turned on my side, then the other, trying to shake the feeling that something had shifted, even though nothing visible had changed. The next morning, I woke up groggy and irritated, annoyed at myself for letting a stranger's words crawl under my skin. Life resumed its usual rhythm. Coffee brewed. Emails piled up. Conversations stayed shallow. From the outside, I was still the same person, moving through familiar routines. But internally, something was off balance. I caught myself zoning out, wondering how much of my life was truly private and how much had been quietly observed without my consent. When I returned home that evening, the hallway lights flickered faintly, casting long shadows against the walls. I slowed my steps, suddenly hyper-aware of every sound. A door closing. Footsteps above me. A muted laugh from an apartment nearby. It felt foolish, yet unavoidable. I wondered who else might be watching, listening, forming opinions about a life they only saw in fragments. Over the next few days, Mark seemed to appear everywhere. Not intentionally, not obviously, but often enough to feel deliberate. By the mailboxes. Near the parking garage. Once, at the corner cafe across the street. Each time, he greeted me politely, never crossing a clear boundary, yet always leaving me with the sense that he knew more than he should. Our conversations were brief, but layered with pauses and half-finished sentences that made my skin prickle. One afternoon, while sorting through mail, I noticed a letter slipped under my door. No return address. No name. Just my apartment number written neatly on the envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single folded page with a short message written in careful handwriting. "You're not imagining it. Trust yourself." I stood frozen in the hallway, my heart pounding. There was no threat. No demand. Just a statement that felt far more unsettling than anger ever could. Someone knew I was doubting myself. Someone knew I was questioning reality. And worse, someone wanted me to believe them. I spent that evening pacing my apartment, checking locks, peering through the peephole, replaying every recent interaction. Had Mark written it? Or was that assumption just fear looking for a face? I realized how quickly uncertainty could spiral into paranoia when answers were missing. As the days passed, small things began to stand out, things I had ignored before. Conversations that ended abruptly when I entered a room. A neighbor who suddenly avoided eye contact. The subtle shift in how people looked at me, like they were trying to place me within a story I hadn't been told. It made me feel exposed, like my life had become a puzzle others were assembling without my permission. One evening, as I was taking out the trash, Mark appeared again, leaning casually against the wall near the exit. He didn't smile this time. "You got the note," he said quietly. My stomach dropped. "What note?" He studied my face carefully, then sighed. "You don't have to pretend with me." Anger flared, sharp and unexpected. "You crossed a line," I snapped. "Whatever you think you know, whatever game you're playing, it needs to stop." He raised his hands slowly. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to warn you." "About what?" I demanded. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not here. And not yet." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about curiosity or gossip. This was about control. About information being used like leverage, dangled just out of reach. And I hated how powerless it made me feel. That night, I made a decision. I would stop ignoring my instincts. I would stop brushing off discomfort as imagination. Whatever was happening, whether it involved Mark, the building, or truths about my own life, I was done pretending it didn't matter. Because once you realize you're being watched, the scariest part isn't the watcher. It's discovering how long you've been asleep. After that night, my apartment no longer felt like a refuge. The walls seemed thinner, the silence louder. Every creak of the floorboards made my shoulders tense. I started noticing patterns, tiny ones at first. The elevator taking longer than usual. Packages delivered to my door that I hadn't ordered, only to disappear hours later. It felt as though my routine was being studied, tested, mapped. I tried to tell myself it was stress, that fear had sharpened my imagination, but deep down I knew better. This wasn't random. I decided to change my habits. I left earlier for work, came home later, took the stairs instead of the elevator. I avoided common areas. Yet no matter how careful I was, Mark always seemed one step ahead, like he anticipated my movements without ever following me outright. That restraint was somehow more unnerving than open pursuit. It suggested patience. Planning. One evening, as I returned home exhausted, I noticed my door was slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there for a long moment, listening. No sounds. No movement. Slowly, I pushed the door open. Nothing appeared disturbed. No drawers rifled through, no items missing. But the air felt different, heavy, as if someone had just left. On my kitchen counter sat my notebook, the one I kept hidden in a drawer, open to a page I hadn't written yet. At the top of the page, in unfamiliar handwriting, were the words, "You're closer than you think." That was the moment fear turned into resolve. Whoever was doing this wanted me unsettled, unsure, doubting my grip on control. And I refused to give them that satisfaction. I took photos, documented everything, dates, times, details. I started talking to myself out loud, grounding my thoughts, reminding myself that awareness was power. The next day, I confronted the building manager, an older woman who had worked there for years. She listened politely, nodding, but her eyes betrayed discomfort. When I mentioned Mark by name, her expression changed, just slightly. "He keeps to himself," she said carefully. "Always has." "That's not an answer," I replied. She sighed, then lowered her voice. "There have been complaints. Over the years. Nothing concrete enough to act on. He has a way of knowing things. People usually move out before it becomes a problem." That sentence settled heavily in my chest. People didn't report him because leaving was easier than fighting something they couldn't prove. I wondered how many others had felt this same creeping fear, this slow erosion of safety. That night, Mark knocked on my door. I didn't open it immediately. I stood there, heart racing, listening to his steady breathing on the other side. When I finally unlocked the door, I kept the chain on. "You shouldn't ignore me," he said calmly. "You shouldn't be here," I replied. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're asking the wrong questions. You think this is about me watching you. It's not." "Then what is it about?" I demanded. He hesitated, then spoke words that sent a chill through me. "About what you forgot." I stared at him, confusion battling fear. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You will," he said. "Soon." Before I could respond, he stepped back, hands raised, as if to show he meant no harm, and walked away down the hallway. That night, memories I hadn't thought about in years surfaced uninvited. Moments I had brushed aside, explained away, buried under routine. A disagreement with a former friend that ended too abruptly. A missing envelope I never followed up on. A decision I made years ago that felt small at the time, but suddenly loomed larger in hindsight. What if this wasn't about surveillance? What if this was about consequences? I realized then that fear often disguises itself as mystery. We assume someone else holds the power because we've convinced ourselves we don't. But power shifts the moment you stop running from the truth, even your own. By morning, I knew one thing for certain. This story didn't start in the elevator. And it wasn't going to end there either. The next few days passed like I was living underwater, everything muted yet unbearably heavy. Mark's words echoed in my head again and again, about what you forgot. I replayed my past in fragments, searching for cracks, for moments I had deliberately sealed off because they were inconvenient or painful. We all do that, don't we? We tell ourselves we're moving on when we're really just burying things deeper, hoping time will dissolve them. But time doesn't erase anything. It preserves it, waiting for the right moment to resurface. I started pulling out old boxes from the back of my closet, documents, letters, photos I hadn't touched in years. Dust clung to my fingers as I sifted through memories that felt like they belonged to someone else. There were faces of people I once trusted, names I hadn't spoken out loud in a decade. And then I found it. A thin folder, tucked between tax papers and expired warranties. Inside was a copy of a police report that had never gone anywhere. An incident I had convinced myself was resolved simply because no one followed up. It had happened years ago, in another city, another version of my life. A neighbor back then too. Friendly. Helpful. Always around. When things went wrong, when boundaries were crossed in a way that left me shaken, I chose silence over confrontation. Not because I didn't know it was wrong, but because I was tired. Tired of explaining. Tired of proving my fear was valid. The case faded, and so did I, from that place, from those people, from the woman I was then. My stomach tightened as a realization settled in. Mark didn't just know my routine. He knew my pattern. My habit of withdrawing. Of enduring quietly. That afternoon, I noticed someone waiting near my building entrance. A man I didn't recognize, pretending to scroll on his phone. When our eyes met, he looked away too quickly. I walked past him, heart pounding, pretending calm while every instinct screamed danger. Upstairs, I locked the door and leaned against it, breath shallow. This wasn't paranoia anymore. It was escalation. I called my sister that night. I hadn't planned to. The words spilled out before I could stop them. She listened in silence, the kind that doesn't interrupt but weighs heavily. When I finished, she said something I hadn't expected. You know, she said softly, you've always tried to handle things alone. Even when you didn't have to. Her words hurt because they were true. Independence had become my shield, but also my prison. I realized then that surviving something doesn't mean it's over. It just means you're still here. Healing requires something else entirely. The next morning, I made a decision that scared me more than staying silent ever had. I went to the police station. This time, I didn't minimize. I didn't soften the details. I didn't apologize for being afraid. I laid everything out, the notes, the patterns, the past incident. The officer listened, typing steadily, occasionally glancing up to ask clarifying questions. It wasn't dramatic. There were no promises. But for the first time in a long while, I felt seen. When I returned home, Mark was waiting by the mailboxes. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, he said calmly. No, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I'm finally seeing it for what it is. His expression flickered, just for a second. Annoyance? Surprise? I couldn't tell. But it was enough. You think involving them will protect you? He asked. I think staying silent never did, I said. He studied me, as if reassessing a strategy. People like you always think the story ends when someone listens. And people like you, I said quietly, count on us believing that. I walked away before he could respond. My legs felt weak, but my spine felt straighter than it had in years. That night, I slept with the lights on. Fear didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It no longer controlled the room. It sat in the corner, acknowledged but not obeyed. I understood now that whatever Mark was trying to awaken in me, guilt, shame, hesitation, it had lost its grip. Because remembering isn't weakness. And forgetting is never protection. This wasn't just about a neighbor. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself I had abandoned to survive. And I wasn't finished yet. After that night, something inside me shifted, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the quiet way tectonic plates move beneath the earth, unseen yet powerful enough to change landscapes. I stopped pretending that courage meant fearlessness. Courage, I realized, was fear walking forward anyway. I began documenting everything, dates, times, small interactions that once felt too trivial to matter. A glance held too long. Footsteps echoing behind me when I hadn't heard anyone enter the building. The way Mark always seemed to know when I was coming or going. Patterns became visible once I allowed myself to see them without excuses. The police followed up, slowly, methodically. Not with urgency, but with consistency. And consistency, I learned, is how safety is rebuilt. Friends noticed the change in me before I did. I spoke more carefully but stood more firmly. I no longer laughed things off to keep the peace. Peace built on silence was never peace at all. One evening, as rain streaked the windows and the city hummed in that distant, restless way it does at night, there was a knock on my door. Not loud. Not demanding. Controlled. My heart raced, but I didn't freeze. I checked through the peephole. Mark stood there, empty-handed, wearing that same measured expression, the one that always suggested reasonableness, as if the problem was simply a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared up. I didn't open the door. I spoke through it. He said he wanted to talk, that things had gotten out of hand, that involving the police was unnecessary and embarrassing for everyone. Everyone, he said, as if my fear was a shared inconvenience. I told him, calmly, that any communication from now on would go through my lawyer. The word felt foreign on my tongue, but powerful. There was a long pause. Then his voice dropped, losing its softness. He warned me about making enemies, about how stories can turn, about how people don't always believe women who change their minds years later. I felt the old instinct rise, to apologize, to retreat, to doubt myself. Instead, I took a breath and reminded myself of something crucial: the truth doesn't require permission to exist. I told him to leave. When he didn't respond, I repeated it. Finally, his footsteps faded down the hall. I locked the door and slid down against it, shaking, but intact. Days later, I learned he had moved out. No announcement. No explanation. Just gone. Relief washed over me, followed closely by an unexpected grief, not for him, but for all the years I had spent accommodating discomfort instead of confronting it. I thought about how many women live entire lives adjusting themselves to avoid provoking others, mistaking endurance for strength. I thought about the version of myself who believed silence was maturity. She did the best she could with what she knew. I forgive her now. The investigation didn't end neatly. Life rarely offers that courtesy. But I wasn't waiting for closure anymore. Closure isn't something someone else hands you, it's something you build by refusing to keep old wounds open just to prove they hurt. I began volunteering again, this time at a community center that supported women navigating harassment and intimidation. Sitting in those circles, listening to stories that echoed mine in different voices, I understood how deeply connected we all are by what we survive quietly. Strength multiplied when shared. Fear shrank when named. One afternoon, as sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked older, yes, but clearer. Less softened at the edges. There was a steadiness in my gaze that hadn't been there before. I thought about how Mark had tried to reduce me to my past silence, assuming it defined my future. He was wrong. Silence was a chapter, not the title. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy. I tell it because somewhere, someone is questioning whether they're overreacting, whether it's worth the trouble, whether staying quiet might be easier. Easier isn't safer. Forgetting isn't healing. And politeness is never owed at the cost of your peace. If my story has taught me anything, it's this: survival isn't the end of the journey. It's the beginning of choosing yourself, every day, even when your voice shakes. Especially then. Time didn't rush forward after that, it unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if testing whether I truly meant the boundaries I had drawn. Weeks passed, then months, and the building began to feel like mine again, not just a place I occupied, but a space where my breath no longer shortened when the elevator doors opened. Still, healing isn't linear. Some mornings I woke with a tightness in my chest, memories resurfacing without warning, the sound of footsteps, the weight of being watched, the way fear teaches your body before your mind understands. But instead of pushing those moments away, I sat with them. I learned that acknowledging fear doesn't give it power, ignoring it does. I started therapy, something I once believed was only for people who had completely fallen apart. I hadn't fallen apart, I had been slowly eroded. And erosion, I learned, deserves care too. In those sessions, I spoke aloud things I had only ever whispered inside myself. How I doubted my own reactions. How I worried people would think I was dramatic. How I spent years prioritizing harmony over honesty. My therapist didn't rush me. She didn't label me weak or brave. She simply listened, and that alone felt radical. Piece by piece, I began to understand how deeply women are conditioned to manage other people's comfort, even at the expense of their own safety. Naming that truth was painful, but freeing. It allowed me to reframe my past not as failure, but as survival within a system that rewards silence. Around this time, the police investigation reached a quiet conclusion. There wasn't a courtroom showdown, no public reckoning. But there was a record. A documented pattern. A line drawn that couldn't be erased. And while part of me had wanted something louder, more definitive, I realized that justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it comes as prevention. Sometimes it's knowing someone else might be spared because you spoke when it was hardest. I began reclaiming parts of my life that had shrunk during those months of fear. I hosted dinner again, something I had stopped doing without fully realizing why. The first night, my hands trembled as I set the table, but laughter slowly filled the apartment, and with it came a reminder of who I was before caution dominated my every decision. Friends commented that I seemed different, not happier exactly, but steadier. More present. Less apologetic. I took that as the highest compliment. One evening, while walking home under a sky bruised purple by dusk, I felt something unfamiliar: lightness. Not the absence of fear, but the absence of constant vigilance. I realized I wasn't scanning every face anymore. I wasn't rehearsing escape routes in my head. My shoulders weren't permanently raised. It struck me then how exhausting fear truly is, not just in moments of danger, but in the way it steals your attention, your energy, your joy. Releasing it felt like laying down a weight I had forgotten I was carrying. I received a message from a woman at the community center shortly after. She said my story had helped her speak to her landlord about a situation she'd been minimizing for years. She thanked me, not for fixing anything, but for making her feel less alone. I sat with that message for a long time. Stories don't need perfect endings to matter. They need honesty. They need humanity. They need someone willing to say, "This happened to me, and I survived it imperfectly." Looking back, I no longer measure my growth by how fearless I feel. I measure it by how little I abandon myself. By how quickly I listen to that quiet inner voice instead of dismissing it. By how firmly I say no without explaining myself. I used to think strength meant endurance. Now I know it means discernment, knowing when to stay, and when to walk away. I don't know where Mark is now, and I no longer wonder. My life is not shaped around the shadow of someone else's actions anymore. It is shaped around intention. Around choice. Around the understanding that safety is not something you wait for, it's something you participate in creating. And if you're listening to this, sitting somewhere familiar, wondering whether your discomfort counts, whether your fear is justified, let me say this clearly, it does. You don't need proof to protect yourself. You don't need permission to speak. And you don't need to wait until things become unbearable to choose yourself. I waited longer than I should have. You don't have to. There is a quiet moment that comes after survival, one no one really prepares you for, the moment when life asks, now what? For me, it arrived on an ordinary afternoon as I stood by the window, watching people come and go below, each of them carrying stories I would never know. I realized I was no longer defined by what happened in that elevator, or by the fear that followed. The memory still existed, but it no longer occupied the center of my identity. Instead, something else had taken its place, clarity. The kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in slowly, like dust after a storm. I began noticing how differently I moved through the world. I made decisions faster, trusted my instincts more, and stopped negotiating with my own discomfort. When something felt wrong, I didn't wait for evidence or reassurance. I listened. That shift alone changed everything. I ended friendships that relied on my silence. I declined invitations that drained me. I spoke honestly even when my voice shook. And each time I did, the shaking lessened. Courage, I learned, isn't a personality trait, it's a muscle that strengthens with use. One evening, the building hosted a small residents' meeting. I almost didn't go. The old version of me would have found a reason to stay home, to avoid shared spaces, to remain invisible. But I went. I sat among neighbors whose names I now knew, whose faces no longer blurred into threats. When the topic of safety came up, I spoke. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Just clearly. I talked about lighting in the parking garage, about security cameras, about protocols that needed updating. People listened. They asked questions. Changes were agreed upon. It wasn't about my story anymore, it was about collective responsibility. And in that moment, I understood something powerful. Speaking up doesn't always re-traumatize you. Sometimes it restores you. After the meeting, a woman approached me quietly. She didn't ask for details. She didn't offer advice. She just said, "Thank you for saying what I've been afraid to say." That sentence stayed with me. Fear thrives in isolation, but it weakens when exposed to shared truth. I had spent so long believing my experience was something to be endured privately, something that would make others uncomfortable. But discomfort, I realized, is not the same as harm. Silence is. At home, I started writing again, not for anyone else, but for myself. I wrote about the woman I used to be and the woman I was becoming. I wrote about grief, anger, relief, and the strange guilt that sometimes follows healing. I wrote about how survival can feel like betrayal to the version of you that once believed endurance was the highest form of love. The pages didn't judge me. They didn't rush me. They simply held space. And in that space, I reclaimed parts of myself I thought were gone forever. There were still moments of doubt. Late at night, when the world grew quiet, old questions tried to resurface. Should I have done more? Said something sooner? Trusted myself earlier? But instead of spiraling, I answered those questions with compassion. I did the best I could with what I knew then. Growth doesn't require self-punishment. It requires honesty. As time passed, I stopped framing my story as something that happened to me and began seeing it as something I moved through. That distinction matters. One implies passivity, the other, agency. I wasn't a victim frozen in time. I was a person in motion, learning, adapting, choosing differently. That realization changed how I saw my future. I wasn't trying to return to who I was before. I was becoming someone new, someone more aware, more grounded, more willing to protect her peace. If you're listening to this and waiting for a moment of certainty before you act, let me tell you something gently. Certainty rarely comes first. Action does. You don't need a dramatic breaking point to justify change. A quiet knowing is enough. A repeated discomfort is enough. Your inner voice doesn't need to scream to be valid. I once thought strength meant tolerating what made me uneasy. Now I know strength means refusing to live small just to keep others comfortable. And that lesson, learned the hard way, is one I carry with me, not as a wound, but as wisdom. There is something deeply transformative about reaching the end of a story you never wanted to tell but had to survive. By the time I understood that, I was no longer angry in the way I once had been. Anger had done its job, it had woken me up, pushed me forward, demanded change. But it didn't need to stay forever. What replaced it was something quieter and far more powerful: ownership of my life. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come, explanations that would never satisfy, or closure that someone else had to provide. Closure, I learned, is not something you receive, it's something you decide. I began rebuilding my days intentionally. Mornings became sacred instead of rushed. I opened windows, let light in, drank my coffee slowly, and reminded myself that peace was not laziness, it was recovery. I no longer filled my calendar just to feel needed. I chose presence over productivity, honesty over harmony, rest over obligation. And with every small choice, I felt myself returning, not to who I was before everything happened, but to who I was always meant to be. People sometimes ask how I moved on, as if there was a single moment or method. The truth is far less dramatic. I didn't move on. I moved forward, carrying what I learned instead of dragging what hurt. I learned that kindness without boundaries is self-abandonment. That silence can be mistaken for strength, but it often costs too much. That trusting yourself after betrayal is an act of courage, not recklessness. Most importantly, I learned that my worth was never up for debate, no matter who questioned it, ignored it, or tried to diminish it. There were days when fear still whispered, reminding me of how quickly safety can fracture. But fear no longer controlled my decisions. I acknowledged it, thanked it for trying to protect me, and then chose differently. Healing doesn't erase fear, it teaches you not to obey it blindly. And that distinction changed everything. Over time, my story stopped feeling heavy to carry. It became something I could share without shaking, without apologizing, without shrinking. Not because it stopped mattering, but because it no longer defined me. I was no longer living in reaction to the past. I was responding to the present with clarity and intention. That shift, subtle but profound, was the real turning point. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself in my story, I want you to know something important. You are not weak for staying, and you are not broken for leaving. Survival looks different for everyone. There is no timeline for healing, no universal script for courage. What matters is that you listen to the part of you that knows when something isn't right. That voice is not dramatic. It's not loud. But it is wise. I used to believe my role in life was to keep things running smoothly, even if it meant disappearing in the process. Now I understand that my responsibility is not to maintain comfort at the cost of my dignity. Peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the presence of self-respect. And once you taste that kind of peace, you stop negotiating it away. This is not a story about revenge or victory in the way movies portray it. No one clapped. No dramatic confrontation fixed everything. Life simply became clearer. Quieter. More honest. And in that honesty, I found freedom. Not the loud kind, but the lasting kind. So if there's one thing I hope you take from my story, let it be this: you are allowed to change. You are allowed to choose yourself without justification. You are allowed to walk away from what harms you, even if others don't understand. Especially then. My story doesn't end with fear. It ends with truth. And truth, once claimed, has a way of carrying you forward, steady, grounded, and unafraid.